I've been with Ecology since 2009, working in the water quality section, the stormwater water quality section. Started out working on grants that ended up being turned into the storm financial assistance program that's giving out multiple millions of dollars of grants this year. And following that, I started working more on the permits and the manuals. So I've been dealing with stormwater since 2009 at Ecology. So I'm familiar with what's going on, and I'm part of the editing program for the manual. So I'm happy to be here today, and thank you, Lori, for setting this up. And those of you who are interested in Eastern Washington, I'll be speaking tomorrow morning at this time on the Eastern Washington Manual. So if you're looking at working on both sides of the state, here's an intro on the manual for each side of the state. So my plan today is to discuss the updates that we made to the 2024 Stormwater Manual since the 19 manual, when we released our new permits in July 1st of 2024. We released new versions of the two manuals to go along with those. And I want to talk about changes that we made between the 2019 and the 2024 manuals. And then I want to get into a little bit of discussion about exemptions. These did not change. We didn't change what is exempt and what isn't exempt. What we have done is we've done do some more effort about explaining what we mean by exemptions and what should be considered exempt and what should not be considered exempt from the minimum requirements, and how we have adjusted the manual to reflect those things. We also are doing a lot more interface between the permit and the UIC rule, two different ways of dealing with stormwater being discharged to the ground. I'll talk a little bit more about how those two issues interact and how you as a designer or you as a reviewer would refer to those. And then I want to talk a little bit more in more detail about minimum requirements 5 through 9. In most of my presentations that I've done recently, I've covered all 9 minimum requirements. 1 through 4 are fairly simple, and I don't feel the need to cover those today. If you are an agency, an organization that wants a class that talks about the manual in detail on how to go through a review of a submittal to you, I'm happy to participate. And at the end of this presentation, you can get my email address if you want it. And then hopefully I'm leaving some time at the end for questions. If you do have questions while we're moving along, put them in the chat. And Lori, I believe, is looking at the chat. And so, Lori, if questions come up and are put into the chat and you think it's a good thing to ask at that point in time, go ahead and interrupt and ask me that question. But I will have time at the end. I break the presentation into segments, and I have a place for questions at the end of each segment that I can answer then. And again, at the end, we'll should have some time at the end. So let's start talking about the 2024 manual, the status of the 2024 manual. We released it in July of 2024. So it is in effect right now for those whose ordinances state that they need to use the latest version of the Stormwater Manual. This is the latest version of the Stormwater Manual. Different jurisdictions have different ordinances. Some say use the latest version, and some say use the 2019, and they need to get the ordinance changed to reflect the 2024 version of the manual. There is UIC guidance in this document, and that is official right now. Whether your ordinance says use the 2024 version or the latest version or the 2019 version, you still should use this guidance if you're going to be doing UIC work. Phase ones have to adopt this manual or an equivalent manual by July 1 of 2026. And phase twos have to adopt this manual or an equivalent manual by June 30th of 2027. They have a little bit more time. We're giving them time to get used to the manual and to change their ordinances that they have so that the ordinances agree with what the manual and the permit says. And we're giving them time. The phase ones, all 5 phase ones have or 6 phase ones have an equivalent manual. And all 6 of those equivalent manuals will be reviewed by Ecology for equivalency. We don't review phase 2 manuals for equivalency. If the phase 2s put a manual out and it differs from the bar manual in some substantial way, and they get sued by an entity for doing something that doesn't agree with the permit, and they're using their manual, it doesn't agree, they're on their own. Pretty much Ecology won't be able to defend them because they are not doing things in line with what Ecology requires. So be careful about phase 2 permits or manuals because they may not be in full compliance with our manual. Hopefully they are, but Ecology has not checked them to make sure they are. And the manuals are used by many more permits than just the municipal permit. The industrial permits references primarily volume 2, or volume 4, excuse me, the source controls. Construction references volume 2 primarily. Sand and gravel and other permittees reference BMPs in volume 5, and there's other things that are going on. So the manual has a lot of things in it that don't really refer directly to the municipalities, but the municipal permit, but they are important for other permits we have in the state. So things that haven't changed, we still have the same 9 minimum requirements. They have the same names, they have the same descriptions, and they have the same requirements for to meet them, and the same requirements to determine if they need to be met. We have not changed the project thresholds for new development. We did make some changes in the redevelopment project thresholds, particularly when it comes to looking to see if you need to meet minimum requirements 6 through 9 for replaced hard surfaces. I will talk about this in much more detail a little bit later when I get to the flow charts, but we have made some changes, primarily brought on by the discovery of 6-PPD and its impact on fish, particularly coho salmon, and the need to make more roadway projects to be under the guidance of the manual for replaced hard surface. Right now, under 2019 rules, not a lot of replaced hard surface on redevelopment projects has to be treated for flow control and treatment. By adding this replaced value in the thresholds for redevelopment, we're bringing more of those in. We have not changed our design criteria for treatment and flow control BMPs. So if you're designing a biofiltration swale, you're going to be using the same sizing criteria, same bottom width, same depth, same media. All those kind of things are still in place and have not changed from probably 2011, but definitely 2019. And we have identified 2 runoff models, WWHM and MGS flood. Both are acceptable to Ecology. Versions later than the ones identified here are acceptable. Versions earlier than these are not acceptable. We've been making changes to the models over time. There is a standard Ecology model, WWHM, that's free online. You can download that. The company that created WWHM has created and added a bunch of bells and whistles to WWHM that they sell. And if you want to use that version, as long as it's version 4.2.16 or later, you can use that version. The big thing that they have on that is that tape devices, things like Filtera and storm filters, have a module in WWHM now, so that you can size your tape device automatically in WWHM without having to go through the, the calculation of calculating the water quality design flow rate and, and dividing that by the inches per hour allowed for the device to get the surface area of the device and size the device that way. You can size it easier using the modeling software that's going to cost you money to buy, as opposed to the free version. Some of the things we've done in changing these is we're striving to get statewide consistency between the things we can get statewide consistency on. Things like design criteria for BMPs. We are posting the manual online using a software called Flare. And that software allows us to create a lot of individual files. They're called topics in Flare. We can create individual topics. And then what we do when we create the big manual is we attach all these topics together in a certain order. And if we have one topic that's the same for both sides of the state, we could use that same topic in both manuals. And we don't have to have separate versions that say Eastern Washington versus Western Washington. The Flare will automatically do that for us. If we're in Western Washington, it'll use the language that we want in the Western Washington manual. And if we're in Eastern Washington, it'll substitute the appropriate words and give us Eastern Washington. So we're trying to make our as consistent as possible. And the first place we're doing that is in our BMP design criteria. We still have numbering differences between the two manuals, but the data, the information, the criteria is still the same in both. We've also done a lot of work to consolidate repetitive material, things that we found in multiple places. For example, we've prepared this one in the 2019 manual, but in the 2014 manual, we had text in volume 2 that referenced somebody to volume 5. And you'd get your information to volume 5. We also had text in volume 5 for different BMPs that referenced you to volume 3. And that became very confusing. And so now we've changed our volume numbers and what's in those volumes so that there's no back and forth going on anymore. You go to volume 3 to find what BMPs you need to use, and you go to volume 5 to design those BMPs. You don't have to go back and forth on those things. We've also revised the text for clarity in a number of places. We answer a lot of questions about the manual. We get a lot of email asking us questions, and we keep track of those questions we're asked and why it wasn't clear, why our language wasn't clear, and we are revising the text in subsequent manuals to take care of those issues. And we've also reordered sections for a better flow of the concepts. And we feel that as you read your way through, work your way through volume 3, for example, it makes sense as you move your way through volume 3 to go through the section on selecting your water quality treatment BMPs. And then once you've selected that, now you can go and select your flow control BMPs as necessary. So we think we've improved the clarity of what we're doing. So continuing on with that, we have corrected typos and errors. There's always going to be typos and errors, and we've eliminated redundancies. We've also identified 10 significant changes that we've made to the manual between 2019 and 2024. And the reason we've done this 10 significant changes piece is we want to make our review of the phase 1 manuals a little simpler. We don't want to have to read 6 manuals cover to cover and review their entire manual, things that we've decided on in the past and they're not changing and it's still in compliance with our permit. We don't want to go and read that and make comments on that and take time and effort to look at that. So what we're telling the phase one communities is that here are 10 what we feel are significant changes, and we feel you need to make changes to your manual to reflect these changes. And we've built a table that has those 10 changes in them. We've got a place for them to identify their current language, their proposed language, and for us to look at those and decide, yes, they're still in agreement. No, they haven't changed it correctly. They have to do this instead. So it makes it easier for the 4 of us who are reviewing these 6 manuals to, with deadlines, to review those manuals within those deadlines. And so I'm going to go through those 10 significant changes now so you can see what those are and be aware that these things are different, even if you're not creating your own manual. So the first one is, and I alluded to this earlier, about the redevelopment project thresholds. We've gone to the project level, and that's the flow charts. So what we call flow charts is making a determination on a project level of what minimum requirements you have to meet. So the flow chart we're going to go through in a minute is going to identify, do you have to deal with minimum requirements 1 and 2 only? Do you have to deal with minimum requirements 1 through 5? Or do you have to deal with minimum requirements 1 through 9 for new, for 1 through 5 for new and replaced hard surface, and 1 through 9 for new hard surface only, or 1 through 9 for new and replaced hard surface? Those are project level determinations. Once you get to that project level determination, you know the number of minimum requirements you have to meet. You then go and meet the minimum requirements. And there are secondary thresholds to a couple of those minimum requirements that make things a little bit tighter and may make it so you don't have to do minimum requirement number 6, or you do have to do minimum requirement number 6. I'll talk about those down the line. But the primary thing we made the change in is we've added and replaced hard surfaces in several places in the bottom half of the redevelopment flowchart. If those of you who are familiar with the redevelopment flowchart, the top half is almost identical to the new development. The bottom half is where you determine if you have to deal with replaced hard surfaces or not. We've added the term and replaced, and so that brings in more hard surfaces that may need, more replaced hard surfaces that may need to be taken care of. We've gone into the pavement maintenance project and underground utility project exemptions, and we've made better definitions, and we've made a better description of how Ecology interprets these. And that's now in the manual. Our interpretations are now in the manual. And I'll talk about those interpretations when I talk about this specific change. And we've also gone into our wetland hydroperiod protection method number 2, and we've updated the requirements. The requirements used to be that you had to meet certain changes in water levels and volumes uniformly throughout the year. And our changes are, we're making some exceptions for summer months. In the summer months, we may not be able to meet the volume going into the wetland may be too low, just because of the fact that in the summer we don't have any rain. And it has nothing to do with the development going there. It has to do with the fact that there's no rain. So we made some changes to make it a little bit easier to meet the hydroperiod protection method number 2. So those are 3 major changes. So let's talk about the first one in a little bit more detail. And that first one comes into the flow charts, as I said earlier. So what you're looking at right now is the new development flow chart. And it looks very similar to what it was in 2019, except for the first line going across the top. So we are bringing in the idea of underground injection controls have been brought into the manual because the UIC rule allows applicants to use manual information to meet ACART for UICs. And the manual and the UIC rule treat infiltration through UICs differently. And so we needed to make a determination of when when a project has to follow the UIC rule and go through the UIC rule completely, or when the project has to follow the permit. Any new project is going to have to do one or the other. And so we're trying to help you decide which is which. So the first question we're asking is, does all the runoff go to a class 5 UIC well? And if all the runoff goes to the class 5 UIC well, then or wells, plural, you are under the UIC rule. You go to the chapter in the manual describing the UIC rule. You follow the UIC rule. You don't deal with the minimum requirements, but you still need to turn in your stormwater plan to the jurisdiction to review because they have to determine if you're going to discharge into their system or not. If you discharge into their MS4, they're responsible for it. So they have to make sure that your design does meet the UIC rules design. If it doesn't, then you're going to be under the permit. So that's the first decision. If you aren't under the UIC rule, then now we go back to what we did in the previous versions of this chart, and we identify whether you're new development or redevelopment. And if your site has more than 35% of the existing hard surface, your redevelopment, you go to the redevelopment threshold flow chart. If not, you go through this one, you answer it. It's fairly straightforward. These answers just deal with square footage, and you move from there. Now for redevelopment, we have the same start. So some people may go to redevelopment automatically. Are you going to be doing UIC? Maybe yes, maybe no. We put that in both of them just to be sure. Then we ask that 35% question, and instead of no going to see the other chart, yes goes to the other chart. And now we're going through the questions. And the questions we're going through till we get down to this next question are the same questions we ask in the new development flow chart. There's no change. You get to the same point. If you follow this through with the no's and yeses, you're going to get to the same point. And you got to find out that all minimum requirements apply to the new hard surfaces and the converted vegetation areas, but it doesn't say anything about replaced hard surfaces. And now we've got to decide if the replaced hard surfaces in this redevelopment project need to be covered under the minimum requirements. So we had the same question over here, road related. And if you answer no to road related, this box is the same. It has not changed. If you're new plus replaced hard surfaces, okay, note that this one says new hard surfaces only. Now we're saying new plus replaced hard surfaces exceeds 5,000 square feet. So you could have had 3,000 square feet of new hard surface and 8,000 square feet of new plus replaced. So you answer no to this question, no to that question, and yes to this one. The question is, does all stormwater runoff go to the UICs? Then you go to the UIC. If not, you're going to be discharging water to the MS4, and the MS4, by discharging water to the MS4, the rule applies. And you have to follow the permit. So if you design your UIC for the 25-year storm, you're going to have to design, that becomes a flow control device covered by minimum requirement number 7 under the permit because you're discharging runoff from the site to the MS4. All right, so now you've got questions in here about the value of the improvements exceed 50% of the assessed value. And what we're doing here, these two bullets, are we're saying for project site improvements for commercial or industrial projects, all right, and existing site improvements for all other projects. So we are being very specific in our language here. Project site is the area that's disturbed by the work. Site is the area owned by the people who own the site. So let's talk about South Center. The South Center Mall, the site is the parking area and the boundary of South Center Mall in its entirety. If somebody wanted to build a restaurant on the parking area of South Center Mall, just like they've been doing in the past, and they're taking up a corner of South Center Mall and they're building a commercial restaurant there, now it's a commercial project and we're looking at the improved cost, the increased cost on that project site. So now we're comparing the cost of that parking lot that's being replaced by the restaurant. And so that's increasing the value by more than 50%. So they're going to have to deal with replaced hard surface there. If you were using the site, which was our previous language, they're not increasing the value of South Center Mall by more than 50%. So they wouldn't have to, they would be answering no to that. Now we're saying the project site, you're increasing it by more than 50%. And the reason we broke this out in commercial, industrial, and all others is we want to use the site for residential projects. And for the purpose of this threshold analysis, we're considering parks and schools to not be commercial or industrial. We specifically want to exclude parks and schools from the project site boundaries. So if you have a school and they're putting up a series they're building a new building on the campus, we don't want to use the project site as their determination of increased value. We want to use the school property as the value for the increased property. So commercial and industrial in this context do not include parks and schools. And if you answered no to that, you weren't increasing the value by 50%, and you answer both of those aren't true, and you answer no, if you're a commercial or industrial site, do you increase the hard surface by more than 50%? And so we were getting projects that parking lots, they were adding some new pavement and they weren't having to deal with the existing pavement. And we're trying to catch those because those are problems. And that's a new box. That's something new that we've added. And a road related project, we've added plus replaced in that as well. So now if you've got a roadway, it used to be if you had a roadway that you pulled up the existing paving down to base course and put that same paving back in, that's replaced hard surface. And you had a 30-foot wide roadway and you added a new 7-foot wide lane, you were only adding, you weren't adding 50% or more of new hard surface. Now you're adding more than 50% of new plus replaced. So that project does get covered for replaced hard surface. So we're trying to get more replaced hard surface in the values. So flowchart has changed dramatically. You need to look at and follow the questions that are asked here and answer yes or no and follow your way down through and answer yes or no as appropriate. Okay, getting off the flowchart. Let's talk about something a little bit easier for you, not for us. Light rail. Light rail, we've determined that all light rail tracks, both elevated and non-elevated, are pollution generating. So the newest set of designs for light rail, I think it's phase three of light rail as it expands into new areas. Um, they are having to design treatment for their light rail, and jurisdictions that have light rail going through their jurisdiction need to be aware of the fact that it's pollution generating, and they need to evaluate the light rail in that sense. We've people doing light rail have submitted to us a BMP for elevated rail guideways, treatment BMP. So those elevated guideways need to have this treatment BMP. We also have source control BMPs for washing the light rail tracks and for washing the light rail vehicles. So there are new BMPs in the manual that um, if you are updating your phase two manual, you need to be aware of these that are coming in and included. We have not produced new BMPs for nutrients and toxic organics, but we know they're out there and we are working on them. We're working on guidance. And so we've got discussions of nutrients and toxic organics, such as 6-PPD, PCBs, PAHs, PAFs, PFAS, all those kinds of nasty organics that are out there. We are working on finding BMPs that can treat 6-PPD. We don't have any that we know of yet. 6-PPD is so new, we don't know what concentrations to expect in the environment. We don't know what concentrations are safe to discharge into streams. We don't know what BMPs can remove what level of 6-PPD. So until we get that information and have that information go out to the public and have conversations on that information, we can't put anything into our manual to require anyone to do anything about it. We asked for some patience from the people out there to recognize that we are working as fast as we can. The science only moves so fast, and regulatory change only moves so fast. So we're trying to do what we can, but we put out information in the manual that discusses what we're doing, and as new information becomes available, we have a section um, on the page where you get access to the manual. We have a section called emerging guidance, that as we develop emerging information, we're going to post it in that emerging guidance section. We'll be sending out emails letting people know that that's there and that we have that there, and you can look for it, and that's where you'll find what's happening. If we come up with some BMPs that we find can treat 6-PPD, we will identify them under the emerging guidance. We can't put them in the manual without having the manual go out for public comment and hearing. So the best place we can put them is to emerging guidance and tell you that you can use that information if you wish, but you're not required to until it becomes part of the permit and part of the manual. You're not required to use that information, but it's available to you if you want to use it. We are working on climate change as well. We know that people are concerned about, well, if I build a BMP flow control pond today with larger storms, it won't be appropriate in the future. So how big should I make it? And we understand that's a problem. There are some what we would think would be easy solutions to it. One easy solution that we may think would be to take our water quality design flow rate that is calculated in WWHM and multiply it by 1.2 or 1.4 to get a higher flow rate and say design for that flow rate. That's all well and good, but why should we use 1.2 and why should we use 1.4? What's our reasoning for doing those? How do we as a regulator defend that decision? There's always going to be somebody that complains that 1.2 is too low, and somebody's going to complain that 1.2 is too high. So we need to have solid evidence of what we could use to do there. The other place we could make those adjustments is in the WWHM when you select the rainfall data that you're using, that first screen you go to, and you point to the map of your county to identify where your project site is. And it selects a rainfall gauge and it has a multiplier for that rainfall gauge. May read 0.87, may read 1.3, whatever it reads, it's how we are adjusting that rainfall gauge, which isn't local, to that local requirement. And you could go in and you could multiply that adjustment by a 1.2 factor or 1.4 factor and get more rainfall. What that would do is it would multiply the rainfall that is received is in the table by that larger factor, and you get more volume of runoff and higher peak flows. The problem with this is storms in the future are expected to be higher intensity and shorter duration. So if you're using a rainfall that is higher in intensity, but the same length and duration, the response that the pond has to that inflow won't be the same as it would for the shorter duration storm. And you will get an incorrectly sized pond. It'll be incorrectly sized as badly as if you used the lower flow rates, lower rainfall rates. So that's not a solution that we can use. So Ecology is working with the climate people at the University of Washington, you know, national experts in climatology and dealing with this stuff. And they are going to be working on creating new isopluvial maps for all of Washington state. These maps show the expected rainfall in the 2, 5, 10, 25, 50, 100-year storms. And they will also be creating a rainfall data, a rainfall file of years of expected rainfall going out into the future that can be used for the mitigated scenario when you run WWHM. And that will be for all of Western Washington. So no matter where you're working Western Washington, you will have a file created that matches what we think will be the most likely rainfall happening in the future. So when you design your pond or your treatment device, it'll be designed for the correct sizes out into the future. The issue about this is we can't use that rainfall for the pre-developed conditions. So when you run WWHM, you're going to have to run WWHM with the existing pre-developed rainfall. The known historic rainfall will give you your pre-developed condition, and this new rainfall data will run under WWHM for the mitigated condition. And so doing all this, setting it and finding out what the numbers should be, creating the rainfall data, creating the files for rainfall into the future is a big undertaking. And we have the University of Washington under contract to start working on this. We have Clear Creek, the people who created WWHM, under contract to work on this, but it's going to take some time to get there. But we are working to get there. So if you ask us about what we would say about climate change, this is what we're doing. We're trying to get an answer. It's going to take time, but we're going to get there. And in the manual, we've identified some high-level overviews of what's going on. We haven't gotten into that detail where we are, but that is the latest information on what we're doing. In bioretention facilities, things that are BMPs that are required under the list option. For minimum requirement number 5, we've now included the high performance bioretention soil mix in the manual itself. For the last 4 years, it was as a emerging guidance. Now it is in the manual as a BMP. So you can use this if you are in areas where it's phosphorus sensitive. We don't recommend you use this media everywhere. It's more expensive than a default. And if you're doing a bioretention facility that's infiltrating into the ground and not going to a phosphorus sensitive water body, use the less expensive default bioretention soil media, and you'll get the adequate treatment that you need, and you'll meet our requirements. The HPBSM is there for places where you're discharging to phosphorus sensitive water bodies. You're within a quarter mile, or you're going into the ground within a quarter mile of phosphorus sensitive water bodies. It's more expensive, and over in Eastern Washington, it's very difficult to obtain. We do have a design spec. So for the people that are designing this and sending things into their jurisdictions for review, the guidance in the manual is all you need. If you want to create a construction specification, one that identifies the tests that need to be done on all the individual materials that go into the HPBSM, the spec for the sand, the spec for the coconut coir, the text for all the other little magic pixie dusts that are going into the HPBSM. There's all kinds of tests that must be done to show that it's appropriate for use. The specification for that is under the emerging guidance. You have to go to the emerging guidance, find the spec, and pull that spec out and put that into your specification document. If you're planning on using HPBSM and you're going out for bid, that spec needs to be in your specification document so that the contractor knows all the tests he has to go through in order to get an approved bioretention media. Okay. So we included a statement for common plan of development or sale. And we got some guidance to determine if a project is commercial or industrial. And we've done a lot of work with the underground injection controls. So questions that have been built up. Let's talk. That is when we were making that determination of what went in that box, we had a lot of discussion about how do we deal with schools and parks. And instead, without listing schools and parks specifically, we felt calling them non-commercial and not industrial. So they're not for profit. So commercial and industrial are typically private entities that are for profit, whereas schools and parks are more public entities. And so that's kind of our dividing line between what's to keep schools and parks outside the commercial industrial realm. I'm hoping it is. I don't know exactly where it is, but it was definitely a part of our discussion. You look at the jurisdiction has the ability to determine how they want to decide that is it they have to do the same things jurisdiction wide, but they can decide, are they going to use the assessed value? Are they going to use the sale value? Are they going to use the cost of building the project? Each jurisdiction has its own ability to decide which one they want to use, but they have to use the same method everywhere. I'm going to talk about that in more detail in my next section, but the dividing line is, do you expose the subgrade. If you grind and overlay, that's maintenance. You have not exposed the subgrade. If you expose the subgrade, you've created replaced hard surface. I do not know of one. I know they are working on it, but I do not know of a date, specific date for that. I'd have to, Mark Belton, engineer at Ecology, is our MR8 specialist. So if you want to send him an email and ask him that question, um, he can get mad at me for telling you to do that. But I think the jurisdiction can make a decision on their own, decide which way they want to go with that. Yeah, whatever we do is going to have to go to public comment. And so we are, as we move forward through creating our climate change solutions, we will be floating thoughts to go out for public comment, and everybody is available to comment on it. But it doesn't make sense to use projected rainfall data to simulate what happened in forested conditions. That you've got to, if you want to take things back to forested conditions, which we want, you have to simulate forested conditions, and using projected rainfall for forested conditions doesn't make a lot of sense. If you're installing a UIC for flow control, okay, you're putting in a UIC to get some infiltration on the site, and you still have a detention pond or something like that for additional work. You have to register that UIC, but you don't use the UIC rule to determine what treatment you need before water goes into the UIC. You have to use MR6 to determine what treatment you need to do before water goes into the UIC. You still have to register. If you're installing a UIC, you still have to register it. You just don't use the matrices in the UIC rule to determine what level of treatment you have to do. We're not seeing failures of the storm facilities at all, but we are trying to avoid having failures.
Okay, but it's just like, I don't want to take too much time, but it's like, if there's no evidence of like these storm facilities that are being built, say last year, or not haven't failed and probably never fails, like why make it more stringent? I guess is my question.
I think I have a response to that.
Go ahead.
I mean, we experience flooding, in our jurisdiction, and this is because of, building practices in the past. And so these building practices now are I mean, it doesn't even really mitigate that flooding unless stuff is redeveloped. So if anything, it doesn't contribute to that. So if we had been using these standards in the past, then we wouldn't be seeing this flooding that we have now. So I think that's how I see it.
Okay.
All right. So welcome back, everyone. Let's talk about the exemptions now. So exemptions come, you look to see if your project is exempt from the minimum requirements at the start, to save you from having to go through those flow charts and determining whether you have what kind of new hard surface, replaced hard surface, what are your totals and all that kind of stuff. So the first thing you want to look at to see if your project is exempt, and there are some full exemptions, meaning you don't have to deal with any of the minimum requirements. And there are some partial exemptions, meaning you need to deal with primarily been required. Number two are stormwater controls during construction. There's not much to do for been required number one, but it's still listed there. And so under the full exemptions, we have forest practices and commercial agriculture. And there's also a gas and oil exemption. The reason those have full exemptions is because there are other rules. There are WACs and other entities that are giving them permits. And there's no reason for our municipal permit to jump in there and interrupt what they're doing. So those product practices are taken care of completely under a separate permit. And there are some full exemptions for some pavement maintenance activities. And there are partial exemptions for some pavement activities and underground utility projects. And so I'd like to get more detail on what we're talking about here. The first thing I need to do is to identify what we mean by maintenance. So repair and maintenance are on currently serviceable structures that involves no expansion or use beyond that previously existing and results in no significant adverse hydrologic impact. Okay, so it's taking existing hard surfaces and making them better. But it doesn't expand the size and it doesn't change the surface condition and it doesn't change the ability to use it. You know, it's not going to be used for something new and different that it wasn't being used for before. So the fully exempt pavement maintenance activities, when we list those, pothole and square cut patching, overlaying asphalt or concrete with BST asphalt or concrete without expanding the area of coverage, shoulder grading, reshaping, regrading, crack sealing, vegetation maintenance. The overlaying can include scarifying the surface, going in and plating the surface down, but you haven't removed the asphalt completely. You haven't gone down to base course. So if you have an existing roadway and you take a scarify and remove an inch of asphalt and add 2 inches on top of that, and you don't expose the subgrade, that's maintenance. And you don't have to do any stormwater controls because post work, the stormwater is the surfaces are the same as they were pre doing that work in terms of stormwater controls. So these are all fully exempt. Now, some maintenance activities are only partially exempt, and you need to look at those and determine if they are replaced or new hard surfaces and count those against the thresholds you're dealing with for the flow chart. Because we're doing all this before we look at the flow chart. We're doing this to determine how much new hard surface we have and how much replaced hard surface we have. So if you remove and replace an asphalt or concrete pavement to base course or lower, or are repairing the base, these are considered replaced hard surfaces. So scarifying the surface and putting asphalt in, maintenance, removing the asphalt down to base course, replacing it with asphalt or concrete, replaced hard surface. You need to count that against the 2,000 or 5,000 square feet of new and replaced hard surface when you're going through your flow chart. Extending a pavement edge or paving gravel shoulders, those are new hard surfaces. You're changing the runoff characteristics. You're taking the runoff from gravel to runoff from pavement. So it's a new hard surface. And replacing and resurfacing by upgrading from dirt to gravel, bituminous treatment, asphalt or concrete, or upgrading from gravel to chip seal, asphalt or concrete, or upgrading from chip seal to asphalt or concrete. These are all considered new impervious surfaces. So when you're doing your analysis and you're going to the flow chart, you need to take the area you're dealing with here and do the title of either new hard surface or replaced hard surface and put those into your thought process for going through that flow chart. These are not exempt projects by any way, shape, or form. So I got a couple definitions I want to talk about. One of them that's really important is the difference between project site and site. I mentioned this earlier. Project site is that portion of a property or right of way subject to land disturbing activities. New hard surfaces or replaced hard surfaces. The site is the legal boundaries of a parcel or parcels that are subject to new development or redevelopment. For road projects, the length of a project site and the right-of-way boundaries define the site. So there could be areas within the right-of-way that are part of the project, that are part of the site, but are not part of the project site. It could be, on our interstate highways, we got large right-of-ways, and there's large areas of ground out there that counts against the site. But if we're adding a lane to the highway, that's the project site. Impervious surfaces, we need to define impervious surface. It prevents or retards the entry of water into the soil mantle, causes water to run off at a greater quantity. And we list common impervious surfaces. And I often go to this list of common impervious surfaces when people ask me, is X, Y, or Z an impervious surface? This is a definition right out of the glossary in the manual. So if you want to know if something is an impervious surface, go to the glossary and read this. And rooftops, walkways, patios, driveways, parking lots, concrete or asphalt paving, gravel roads, packed earthen materials, oiled and macadam, and other surfaces which similarly impede the natural infiltration of stormwater. Gravel roads and parking are impervious surfaces. I know people are going to say, but it's a gravel road, rain falls on it, it goes right into the ground. Great. Now, what's going to happen in 10 years after people have been driving on it for years and years and years and cracking up all the sand and compacting it? It's going to not be pervious anymore. It's going to be impervious. And that's what we're worried about. We're thinking about what happens in 10 years. We're not thinking about what's happening now. We're concerned about what happens in 10 years. We're asking people to define bioretention using a 10 inches per hour infiltration rate for the bioretention median. We know it flows much faster than that now. We're worried about what's going to happen when it starts getting compacted and starts losing its infiltration capacity and needs to get replaced. That's 12 inches per hour. Another impervious surface that people miss a lot is that if you have an underdrain under what would typically be a pervious surface, like a artificial turf surface field, if you have an underdrain under that, that artificial turf field is considered impervious. It drains through the artificial turf into the underdrain, back out to the surface. It's now an impervious surface. It's not a pervious surface. If you don't have an underdrain, then you can call it pervious. Similarly, pervious pavement. If you install pervious pavement someplace in a parking lot and put an underdrain under it, that's not pervious pavement anymore. That's impervious pavement and must be modeled as pervious pavement. No, You just have to decide as a jurisdiction, are you doing maintenance or are you doing replacement? So you could be
Thank
doing
you.
square cut patching, and that would be maintaining the surface. If you say I'm replacing it from curb to curb and I'm doing square cut patching, replacing it from curb to curb, that's not square cut patching anymore. You got to think about the reasonableness of what you're asking. And if you're doing square cut patching and you're doing it at a corner, and that corner involves replacing the sidewalk at that corner with accessible sidewalk. You have a curb around that corner, and it's not accessible, and because you've gotten to that point, you have to replace it. That replacement is also exempt. That putting in that curb, that accessible sidewalk corner is also exempt, along with the maintenance you're doing on the roadway. You don't have to count that as replaced hard surface. You can count that as exempt because of the maintenance work that's being done. If you're replacing that because of federal rules telling you have to put a accessible curb cut there. So we use hard surface a lot in our flow charts. And hard surfaces are an impervious surface, a permeable pavement, or a vegetated roof. And people ask us why we define hard surfaces. Well, we're trying to avoid someone coming in and saying, well, I'm putting in 8,000 square feet of permeable pavement. Therefore, I don't exceed the 5,000 square feet of impervious surface. Therefore, I don't have to submit anything. And because now I'm not submitting anything, I bet, oh, by the way, I can now put in impervious because I don't have to do anything. Permeable pavement is a BMP to meet minimum requirements 6 and 7. It's not a way to get around the project flow chart. So we called it hard surface to keep you from getting around that project flow chart. If you are putting in permeable pavement, we love it, but you're putting it in to meet minimum requirements, not to avoid having too many square feet of impervious surface. And replaced hard surface replaced impervious surface is for structures, the removal down to what you're exposing the top of the foundation and replacement. And for other hard surfaces, the removal down to bare soil or base course and replacement. And we just had a question about what are we replacing in these terms? And the replacement that we're using here, the term replacement, is talking about replacing what you removed. So in the top one, you remove the structure to get down to the foundation. And if you replace that structure, then you've got replaced hard surface. If you replace the hard surface with something, because you remove the hard surface down to bare soil or base course, and now you're replacing that hard surface, that's what you're replacing. If you're replacing that hard surface down to, you've removed down to bare soil and you're putting vegetation there, you're not replacing, you don't have replaced hard surface. You now have vegetation on that site, and you can count that area as vegetation in your mitigated manual modeling. And a pervious surface is a surface that allows water to infiltrate. It's the opposite of impervious. Okay. It's also it can be permeable pavement without an under drain, and can be artificial turf fields with under drains. I need to back up here a little bit. I neglected to include a slide that I wanted included. And I need to come back here to this point, and I need to come back to the underground utility projects. I need to talk a little bit more about what we mean by underground utility projects and what we mean by the entire project here. If a jurisdiction or a utility needs to install a pipeline in a right-of-way, and they need to remove the asphalt surface, dig the trench, pile the trench material next to the trench, put a pipe in the ground, replace the existing pipe, or put a new pipe in the ground, and backfill that and put new surfacing over that. That project, if that's all they're doing, is that trench, that project is partially exempt. You need to apply minimum requirement number 2. You need to have services, stormwater services during construction on that project, but that project is exempt, except for the construction stormwater controls. Keeping the stockpiled dirt from running away when it rains, that kind of stuff. If that new pipeline is being installed by someone who's developing a site and putting in a subdivision on that site, and they need to extend the city water and sewer 5 blocks from where the city water and sewer ends, and they're building a pipeline, 2 pipelines in the city, that utility project is not exempt. That utility project is part of the replaced hard surface totals for that project, and may need to have the minimum requirements applied to that replaced hard surface. If, as you go through the flow chart, you need to deal with minimum requirements 6 through 9 for the replaced hard surfaces. That may be difficult to do in the right of way. And if you are combining runoff from that replaced hard surface with runoff from the existing surfaces, your BMPs you install must be large enough to handle that entire area. So you may have to do a bigger treatment BMP to handle that entire roadway because that line. Now it is possible. I've got a slide at the very end of this presentation that says jurisdictions may trade surfaces. So if you have roadway surfaces within the subdivision that are expected to have a similar kind of traffic on them as that roadway that just had the utility line put in, you can do additional treatment within the subdivision for surfaces within the subdivision to offset the necessary treatment for the replaced hard surfaces out in the roadway. So you can do more treatment within the subdivision and close to the subdivision to trade off for the work you're doing in the roadway. So if you had to do 5 blocks of utility lines, you could do extra work on the first 2 blocks of the roadway to offset the need for the last 3 blocks. There's a potential for trading, but you cannot declare that roadway underground utility project as exempt. It is not exempt. It's only exempt if that's the only work that's being done. Now, cities may want to put lines in ahead of time. If the project is being done separately from the subdivision under a totally separate contract by the city as opposed to the developer, that's probably okay. It's going to be a little iffy if the developer gets 2 contracts and tries to make one exempt and one not exempt. I don't know how Ecology would look upon a jurisdiction that declares that second one exempt just because it's being done under a separate contract. So there are shady ways around this and non-shady ways around this. So that's my soapbox discussion of underground utility projects. So now let me move ahead to where I was when I backed up and go to questions on exemptions. If you are doing work in the maintenance work into your right of way, and the square cut patching comes up against a curb, a corner, and you need to you have rules that say if that you need to replace, you're under a mandate to replace all your ADA corners. You can count that replacement of the ADA corner as part of the road maintenance exemption. If all you're doing is the road ADA maintenance project, we are internally, we're under a discussion about whether that's exempt or not. But if you're under a mandate to replace your ADA corners or crossings in the middle of streets, you're not changing the stormwater issues. And so we're thinking that should be considered exempt. If you are building a long sidewalk and you're including these ADAs within that long sidewalk, then it's not exempt. It has to be just the ADA portion to be exempt. If you've done if you've put in the required stormwater measures,
Right.
when you build the gravel, okay, so you're adding new impervious surface to that by putting, excuse me, by putting pavement on top of that gravel. That's new impervious surface. And if that new impervious surface, if the existing stormwater controls for that new impervious surface is adequate for that new impervious surface, then you don't have to do anything else. You can use the existing stormwater controls that you've already built for the gravel roadway to deal with the new asphalt. Well, not if we don't change our definitions. You know, our definitions aren't changing. You know, this new impervious surface definition from, gravel being an impervious surface has been an impervious surface since 2001. When you put the gravel road in there, you said you've already built the stormwater controls for the
Right.
gravel road, right?
Right.
Okay, well, if those stormwater controls are for the gravel road, that was designed for an impervious surface. And if those
Okay.
are still adequate, if they still meet the 91% treatment and the flow duration standard, you don't have to do anything. Yeah, you got to replace hard surface now on the whole road, and so you trying to exempt that narrow patch does not make sense. So it's you've got to replace, you got a redevelopment project, so you've replaced the surfacing, replaced hard surface on the roadway, and you have to deal with that. And if it's new plus replaced hard surface greater than 50% of the existing, then you have to do 6 through 9 on the replaced hard surfaces, the new and replaced hard surface. So it's a moot point. You've already exceeded the thresholds with replaced hard surface. All right, so now I said we're going to talk a little about the UIC rule and how it interacts with the permit. I asked people to hold off their questions, a couple of questions earlier, because I said I'd talk about it later. Well, later has arrived. And so the UIC rule was created in 2006 as WAC 173-218 underground injection control program. And a guidance manual was developed in 2006 to go along with that. That guidance manual is no longer in play. All the information that was in that guidance manual has now been moved to the Ecology Stormwater Manual. So that's where you're going to look for things. And so let's take a step back and define what a UIC is, what an underground injection well is, their definitions. So the first three bullets here are all pretty much the same. It's just how you built it. A bored, drilled, or driven shaft whose depth is greater than the largest surface dimension, or a dug hole, or a improved sinkhole, or a natural crevice, all of which have been modified. And the key piece of those is the depth is greater than the largest surface dimension. So if you have a 2x2 catch basin that's 4 feet deep and it doesn't have a bottom to it, that's a UIC because it's 4 feet deep and the largest surface dimension is 2 feet. If you have a pond, a stormwater infiltration pond that is 3 feet deep and it's 50 feet by 50 feet, that's not a UIC because it's not deeper than its largest surface dimension. So you have to look at the size of things. A lot of times you're going to get a 4-foot diameter manhole that's 8 or 10 feet deep. That would be a UIC because it's deeper than its largest surface dimension. Now, the fourth bullet here does not use the depth and surface dimension. It's a fluid distribution system or a trench, which includes an assemblage of perforated pipes, drain tiles, or other mechanisms intended to distribute fluids below the surface of the ground. So trenches are going to be longer than they are deep, right? But we're not using that deeper than the largest surface dimension in that definition. What we are using is it needs to have a perforated pipe in the trench. So you have a infiltration trench that has been backfilled with sand and it has a pipe coming into one end and that pipe stops there and water flows through that trench by going through the sand, by being slowed down by the sand and needed to build up head to make the water flow through the sand down the way. That is not a UIC. A UIC has to have a methodology to get water from where it comes in all the way down through the trench to the far end. So it needs to have a perforated pipe in it. And water needs to be flowing through the perforated pipe and into the ground. Okay. You can also have a trench that has a perforated pipe in it and it intercepts groundwater and water comes into the trench from the ground, goes into the pipe and leaves the trench through the pipe. That is not a UIC. UICs have to be taking water through the pipe and into the ground. So common things that are called UICs are dry wells, drain fields, infiltration trenches with perforated pipe, storm chamber systems with the intent to infiltrate. I got a picture of storm chambers. EPA has defined these devices as UICs. And if you have a UIC, if you're building a UIC, whether you're building it using the guidance of the UIC rule or you're building it using the guidance of MR7 out of the permit and the manual, you must register the UICs with the state. John Bend is the UIC lead for Ecology, and you go online to the UIC website and fill out the application to register your UIC with the state. And you don't need to register every UIC independently. You could register all the UICs for one project at one time. You don't have to do them all independent of each other. What aren't UICs? So buried pipe inner networks that serve to collect water and discharge that water to a conveyance system. Okay, that was an interception trench that catches groundwater before it gets to the footing of a building and takes that water and puts it back into the surface. That's not a UIC. Surface infiltration basins and flow dispersion facilities, those aren't deeper than they are wide. So they're not UICs. And infiltration trenches without the perforated pipe or a similar mechanism to move to move water along the system. Those are not UICs. So how are we managing stormwater in Washington State? We manage it through these two different systems. Underground injection control program includes liquids other than stormwater. Okay, there are a lot of other liquids that can go in the ground that are authorized through the UIC program that aren't stormwater. Okay, so our interaction with the UIC program is solely for Class 5 UIC wells, which are stormwater wells. And the other way we're managing water in Washington State, stormwater in Washington State, is through the NPDES permit program or municipal permits. And the two overlap and they borrow from each other. So the UIC program says you must meet ACART standards. When you build a UIC, you must meet ACART standards. And we're going to the manual, the stormwater manual for their BMPs and their requirements for trenches and dry wells to determine if we are meeting ACART requirements to cover the UIC rule. So you can be installing a UIC, but you're using the BMPs of the manual to tell you how to build that UIC. They overlap. And the UIC program specifically states that you can use the manual for ACART. Now going back to the permit, section S2A of the Municipal Stormwater General Permits, both Phase 1 and Phase 2, by the way, has this language. This permit authorizes the discharge of stormwater to surface waters and to groundwaters of the state from MS4s owned or operated by each permittee. And S1A lists the names of the jurisdictions that are covered. But then in S1A1, the very next paragraph, we say discharges to groundwaters of the state through facilities regulated under the Underground Injection Control Program are not authorized under this permit. Whoa, how do we decide which ones are authorized under the permit and which ones are not authorized under the permit? Which discharge to groundwaters are covered through the UIC WAC 173-218 or are covered under the municipal permit? So in our stormwater manual, we have this language. The MS4 permit does not authorize stormwater discharges to/from UIC wells unless the overflow or discharge from a UIC well drains to an NPDES, municipal separate sewer system, storm sewer system, MS4. So what does this mean? This means that if you send water to a dry well to infiltrate water and not all the water infiltrates through that dry well and some discharges out of that dry well and goes into the MS4, then that whole project is now governed by the permit. It's not governed by the UIC rule anymore. It's governed by the permit. And so we identified, so if, for example, if you've designed a UIC well to infiltrate the 10-year storm and route larger storms to the MS4, then the requirements of the MS4 permit apply, and you need to meet MR6, MR7, MR8, MR9 if you have enough, if your thresholds have been exceeded to meet the permit requirements. Okay, so you see what's going on there? And the permit requirements for treatment going into a dry well are more strict than the UIC requirements going into the dry well. So we had to come to a decision. We had to, well, how do you decide when the water is going, all the flow is going to the UIC or not? When do you find that you have an overflow? When is there overflow or discharge from the UIC well draining to the MS4 or not? So we sat down and scratched our heads and came up with a decision that we said, so over here in Western Washington, everyone is using WWHM or MGS flood to calculate the amount of runoff and how much is going into the ground and how much is bypassing. So if the entire runoff file from the continuous simulation model goes into UICs on your project, then that project is governed by the UIC rule and not by the municipal permit. So going back to the flow chart, up on that first line of the flow chart, if the entire runoff file from WWHM goes into UICs and infiltrates on the site, you are now governed by the UIC rule, and you go to the UIC rule. You say yes, and I go over to the UIC rule, and you don't go through the rest of that flow chart. You don't look at all the other thresholds. You're under the UIC rule, and you determine how much treatment you need under the UIC rule. And note, there is no minimum size project governed under the UIC rule. If you have a 3,000 square foot house or a 1,500 square foot house and you want to put water into the UIC, you're governed under the UIC rule. There's no minimum threshold anymore. The UIC rule covers everybody. There's no minimum threshold for that. And so the local jurisdictions have to kind of help you through that. But if you're not putting the full runoff file into those UICs, you answer no to that first question, and now you go through all the thresholds. Okay, so we made some edits between the 2019 and the 2024, and we've updated the, actually these are edits between the UIC guidance and the 2019 manual, which carried forward to the 2024 manual. So we've updated the Vado zone treatment capacity tables. So when you're looking for how to treat water going into a UIC, you take three tables. One table discusses the Vado zone treatment capacity. That's the soil beneath the bottom of the UIC and the top of the seasonal high water mark. That's a non-saturated layer of soil. And we look at the treatment capacity and depth of that, and we determine if that can provide treatment or not. And we grade it on a scale of yes to high levels to none. And we identify what we have. Is it whatever level it is, given the treatment capacity that we know about from our geotechnical analysis as we started. We also look at the land use. How pollutant loaded is it? Is it an industrial site? Is it a single family house? And we determine what level of treatment would be needed. How much treatment do we need? And then we take how much treatment we need and how much treatment we can get from the ground, and we determine what level of treatment we have to do before we put water into the UIC. Under the UIC rule, we don't have to do any treatment. We just have to put a two-stage dry well before we put water into the dry well. We don't have to do basic treatment, which is required under the permit. So we've changed some of those rules. some of the descriptions of what constitutes treatment. And it's in line with our site suitability criteria that we use to determine treatment for other devices. We've changed the amount of treatment you have to do. In the WAC, it said no treatment for a lot of cases. We've added a two-stage dry well, which is a catch basin with a downturned elbow. And we've also looked at, are you putting dry wells or UICs in the sanitary control areas of wells? You can't do that. It's prohibited now. It was not prohibited in the past. It's now prohibited for people wanting to do UICs. We've also added our guidance for deep UICs. Now, you may think deep UICs are UICs that are 20 feet or deeper. That is not the definition of a deep UIC. A deep UIC is a UIC that breaks through the upper confining layer. So the upper confining layer may be 3 feet down and it may be 5 foot deep, and you may put a UIC that's 10 foot deep there into the aquifer. That's a deep UIC. The protection of that drinking water aquifer has now been reduced because they no longer have that confining layer up at the top to keep shallow infiltration from getting into that aquifer. So if you are building a deep UIC, there are many more specific things you have to do. You have to do an analysis of the vadose zone. You have to do sealing off perched zones. So you can't have water from a perched aquifer go into the UIC well through the confined aquifer and come out in the confined aquifer. You may end up having to have a state waste discharge permit. You're going to have to talk to the water treatment, water purveyor downstream of you to make sure that you're not going into their aquifer too close. So you may have to go through a consultant with them, and you may have to drill and install monitoring wells, or you may have to do extra treatment. There's a school in Western Washington that has PFAS in the water going into their UICs, their deep UICs, and the water district downstream of them is unhappy and asking them to do a bunch more things. And so now that school district is doing a bunch more things. You also need to apply for UIC approval 60 days before construction. We need time to consult with that water district. And there's a search tool online for you to use to see where you're putting in your UIC well, and is it in a protection area for a well. And so that's the end of my standing slides on UICs. That's a good question. It depends upon what direction the runoff of that lawn went to before the project. If the lawn ran off to the street before the project and they're not doing anything to it, it's outside the project site, then that's not counted.
Sure.
But if it gets disturbed and replanted, it's now part of the project site.
Okay,
And
because I could just
from that
see.
has to go. Well, I can't say yes or no on that because
Okay.
because what I'm saying is if you disturb the land, it's part of the project site. And if the runoff from that piece that got disturbed ends up going to an MS4, ends up going to a UIC, then you're under the UIC rule. If the part that got disturbed is now going to the MS4 and not the UIC, then you're under the permit. I think the default you would want to make, if you're looking to see whether to review it under the MS4 or the UIC rule, would be to err towards the permit, because the requirements are stricter on the permit. What I would do is a small amount of driveway going out to the street.
Yeah.
What I do is I'd trade the treatment for that to the treatment on the side that goes to the UIC. And so I do a little bit more. If it's 60 square feet or say 200 square feet going out to the street for the driveway, I would provide treatment for an additional 200 square feet on the UIC side and keep it all under the UIC.
Okay.
So that stuff going out to the street is kind of no longer important, because you've managed to provide treatment and flow control for that new or replaced hard surface on the site. Or if you're going to be treating that, if you're going to put some sort of treatment flow control on that driveway going out in the street, now you're into the permit, unless you put it into a UIC. So let's get started on the last section of today's presentation and talk about what I'm calling the technical MRs, the mineral requirements 5 through 9, that are technical and need the 6 through 9 need to have an engineer involved. 5 may or may not need to have an engineer involved in doing that. So let's work our way through these and see if we can finish off the day with a good feeling here. So mineral requirement number 5 is our on-site stormwater management mineral requirement, where we need to employ on-site stormwater management BMPs to infiltrate, disperse, and retain stormwater runoff on-site to the extent feasible. And in the municipal stormwater permit, we're addressing this on 3 different levels: site and subdivision, which is the one I'm going to be talking about; development codes, which are things that you as a jurisdiction need to have; and on a watershed scale, which we're starting to get into a little bit more now than we were. This is a requirement that came from clear back in our 2005 permit. Our 2005 permit was appealed by the environmental community, saying we didn't do enough for low impact development. And I got appealed to the Pollution Control Hearings Board. And the Pollution Control Hearings Board said, well, in the 2005 permit, you don't have to require low impact development, but you have to make it so that it was not prohibited. And so we changed our 2005 permit to reflect that, but that meant that our 2012 permit, we needed to find a way to require low impact development to be included on all projects on site and subdivision levels. So Ecology created 2 stakeholder committees with a independent party facilitating the committee meetings, and they came up with a solution to the requirement to require LID. And as what comes out of every committee, we have a fairly complicated process that I'm going to try to go through here on this describe. So mineral requirement number 5 is where we apply the on-site stormwater management LID criteria. And We're asking people to use practices on the individual properties to reduce the amount of disruption of the natural hydrologic characteristics. And we want you to show us this in one of two ways. One way is what we call the LID performance standard. And that's where you actually use WWHM to show that runoff from very low intensity, frequent storms has no greater duration than pre-development. And if you can't do that, then we don't want you to get by without doing anything. So we've created a list of BMPs for lawn and landscape, roofs, and other hard surfaces that you must do if they're feasible. So for the LID performance standard, this is the LID performance standard in its entirety. You match post-development discharge durations to pre-development durations from 8% of the 2-year flow to 50% of the 2-year flow. And pre-development is generally forested land cover. You can use any BMP you want to use. If you can get WWHM to show that your post-development durations are less than your pre-development durations, then you're good. And pre-development is a forested land cover. Lately, I've been seeing WWHM models that show pre-development with impervious surfaces and landscaping. That is not pre-development. As you are doing your WWHM modeling, the pre-development should be forested. Your only decision that you have to make there is whether that's type AB soils or type C soils. You should not have any impervious surface. You should not have any landscaping. The only place that you can have those is in very select areas that have been identified as greater than 40% impervious in 1980. And those only occur in selected areas in Seattle and Tacoma and maybe a couple other ultra urban areas. Every place else, it's got to be forested or maybe prairie. So people stop using the wrong pre-developed conditions because I've been seeing more and more of those. So here's my chance to get on my soapbox for that. And what we want to do for the LID performance standard is we're out here between 1% and 10% exceeded. So flow of events that are exceeded 99%, 90 to 99% of the time, the post-developed, the red one has to be lower than the blue line. So this area between about 1% and about 10%, this line is 8% of the this is 50% of the 2-year storm, and this is 8% of the 2-year storm, of the 50-year storm. Excuse me, 8% of the 2-year storm to 50% of the 2-year storm. That's 8%, 8% over here to 50% over here. And this red line has to be lower than the blue line for all those conditions. Just using detention, you won't get there. I'll tell you right now, detention alone won't get you there. You have to infiltrate on the site to get there. You can use bioretention, you could use an infiltration pond, you could use infiltration trenches, you could use dry wells. However you want to get there, if you can get there, you can meet the LID performance standard. If you can't meet the LID performance standard, you have to meet one of our lists. And we have two lists. One list for if you only have to meet minimum requirements 1 through 5 only. Those are projects that are greater than 2,000 square feet, but less than 5,000 square feet of new and replaced hard surface. You use list number 1, and I'll take you through list number 1. List number 1 for lawn and landscape areas is you have to add soil quality and depth. For all the land disturbed on your site during construction that wasn't built on, so that lawn that people drove on was disturbed during the construction, they have to do this. They have to put soil quality and depth on that area and then replant it. What this does is it gives us some a depth of soil that's porous, that in these very frequent low intensity storms, the rain will fall on this soil and it'll stay there, it won't run off. It's going to stay in the pores, and it's giving us better land to grow grass on, to grow vegetation on. So we want you to do that. So if it's feasible, you have to do this. The infeasibility criteria is slope. If it's too steep a slope, you don't have to do this. And I think the slope is like 35%. So if you don't have a steep slope, you have to do this. So that project we were talking about earlier, that the yard was driven on and disturbed, well, they have to do this to maybe require number 5. For roofs, you've got to go through the items we've identified in order, and if it's feasible, you have to do the first one. So for roofs, the first item is full dispersion. So full dispersion is a specific BMP that you have to set aside 60.2 or 62% of your site as undisturbed land, and you have to drain all the water to that undisturbed land, and you can only have a maximum of 10% of your site be impervious. And so that is a site design criteria. If you don't want to do that, you don't have to do that, but it is infeasible if you don't do it. If it's the other piece of that is you can take runoff from the roof because it's non-pollution generating. And if you can put it directly into the ground through dry wells or infiltration trenches, you can do that. And that reduces the amount of runoff that you're going to get from other hard surfaces. If it's a single family residential property and you're going into dry wells or infiltration trenches, and all that's going there is the roof runoff, while it's a UIC, you don't have to register it. There's an exemption in the UIC rule that runoff going into dry wells for single family residential properties that go into the UICs for the roofs don't have to be registered. If you're going to have runoff for any place else going into that trench, that dry well, then you do have to register it. It no longer meets the exemption. If you can't do either of those, you don't have the high enough infiltration rate to do the downspout full infiltration, you have to do rain gardens or bioretention. And the area of the rain garden or bioretention has to be greater than or equal to 5% of the drainage area. And that area is measured at the overflow, not the bottom where you then slope up, but at the overflow. So you've got the bottom, you've got 18 inches of bioretention media, you've got 6 to 12 inches of pooling depth, and the area you're measuring is at that pooling depth. That needs to be 5% of the drainage area. If you can't do that, if it's infeasible to do rain guards or bioretention, then you have to do downspout dispersion systems. You put a pad there for the water to hit and spread out, or you have perforated stub out connections from your stormwater system. Now, bioretention rain gardens has to be feasible. And we thought about this, and then those committees came up with the idea. Well, we can't describe everything that makes it feasible, but we can describe what makes it infeasible. So we're going to give you a whole bunch of criteria, and if you answer that yes to that, it's infeasible, then you don't have to do that BMP. So for bioretention, here's some of the infeasibility criteria. In the manual, we have about 3 pages of this. I've picked just certain ones. So one of them is if field testing is less than 0.3 inches per hour, you don't have to do bioretention. If the distance to groundwater is less than 1 foot, you don't have to do bioretention. And that's the distance from the bottom of the bioretention. So if you're excavating for bioretention and your groundwater is 5 feet and you're excavating down 4 feet, now you have 1 foot of clearance. Okay. There's some more infeasibility criteria. Slope with near an active landfill. You have contamination in the groundwater. You got a drinking water well nearby. You got underground tanks nearby. Infiltration, bioretention, infiltration criteria. So if you answer yes to any of the infiltration infeasibility criteria, you don't have to do that BMP, and you go to the next BMP in line. So for list 1, we have for other hard surfaces. Those are driveways, roads, patios. These are pollution generating. These are not roofs. And so your first option is full dispersion. If you're not going to do full dispersion, then you have a choice of permeable pavement, rain gardens, or bioretention. You can pick which one you want. Rain gardens or bioretention has to be at least 5%. Permeable pavement has to be all the surfaces where it's feasible. Okay, so if you have a roadway and you have high traffic on the roadway, permeable pavement may not be feasible on the roadway, but it can be feasible for the driveways. And you have to choose amongst those 3. If any of them, if they're all unfeasible, you go to the next one. And here's infeasibility criteria for permeable pavement. The ones in green are the same as bioretention. We've added some. We've added arterials or collectors. We don't want to force people to put permeable pavement on busy streets. So if there's an AADT greater than 400, permeable pavement's infeasible. And also, water flows through the permeable pavement and into the ground underneath. So you need treatment in the soils underneath. If the soils underneath the permeable pavement can't provide treatment, it's infeasible. We're giving the local government the ability to put a 10-inch or 6-inch thick layer of sand under the permeable pavement. And if that's in the case, then permeable pavement is feasible because it is providing treatment. There are some more. Permeable pavement and feasibility criteria. Some new ones. What I like is this one right here. Multi-level parking garages and over culverts and bridges. It's infeasible. You have sanding going on. So high-use sites where you're going to have pollutants. When you're going to be sanding for snow, where you have so sedimentation during winter, where you have steep slopes. So various different infeasibility criteria for permeable pavement. Actually, they began in the 2012 manual, but we had to edit and change it to the 2014. So they're in the Appendix 1 of the permit. So they are part of the 2014 permit, the 2019 permit, and the 2024 permit. So they are required. And because they're in the permit, we put them in the manual. So these have been around for a while. There's nothing, we have not made changes to these lists at all, or the LID performance standard. If you have to do minimum requirements 1 through 9, you need to use list number 2. And why do we change lists? Well, because if you're doing 1 through 9, you have to do treatment on the site. 1 through 5 doesn't include treatment. 1 through 9 does include treatment, and we can't let you not do treatment under minimum requirement number 5. If you're installing something that's putting water into the ground without treatment, we can't let that happen if you have to do treatment for minimum requirement 6 through 9. So we've made a couple changes. First change is we could no longer use rain gardens to meet minimum requirement number 5. Rain gardens do not provide a known amount of treatment. Bioretention does. We know what a bioretention soil media can treat. We know how much treatment we get from it, but we don't know what you get with a rain garden because people can put most anything in a rain garden. They can take the existing soil, add some compost, put it back in. That's the rain garden. We don't know what level of treatment we're going to get. So we're not accepting that as something for treatment. And for other hard surfaces, we've changed it from a choice of permeable pavement or bioretention to you have to show that permeable pavement's infeasible before you can go to bioretention. Why do we do this? I can tell you, it's a good reason. Both of these involve infiltration. And the ratio between where the rain falls on permeable pavement and where it infiltrates is at worst 2-to-1. At best, it's going to be 1-to-1. The area you're infiltrating is the entire area under the permeable pavement. We do allow run-on equal to the permeable pavement area. So that would make it a 2-to-1 ratio between where the rain falls and where it infiltrates. For bioretention, if you're making bioretention 5% of the area draining to it, you have a 20-to-1 ratio. You're getting much more infiltration with the bioretention than you are with much better ratio with the permeable pavement than you are with the bioretention. And minimum requirement number 5 is a hydrology minimum requirement. We're worried about reducing flows. So we want to get more flow control. So going through those list 2 steps, soil quality and depth hasn't changed, still the same thing. Roofs, we now still have full dispersion, but we don't have rain gardens listed in roofs, still have the greater than 5%. And other hard surfaces, we have full dispersion first, permeable pavement next, bioretention next, and the sheet flow and contract flow dispersions are still there last. The list still reads very similar. So you're going through the list. You know you couldn't do the LID performance standard because you can't get infiltration on the site. So that's out of the picture. Now you're doing the lists and you work your way through the list and everything is infeasible. Well, the designer needs to show the reviewer that everything is infeasible. You do that by going to the infeasibility criteria, citing that infeasibility criteria, and citing the place in your studies that show that your site is infeasible. And you have to show it for every different type of site. So you can't just say permeable pavement's infeasible because my roadway has too high a AADT. Good. The roadway is infeasible. What about the parking areas? What about the patios? What about the sidewalks? What about the walking area between the driveway and the front door? Is that infeasible? If the only infeasibility criteria you used for the roadway was at high traffic, everything else is feasible, and you've got to do it. You can't declare permeable pavement infeasible for the entire site without showing it's infeasible for every type of use on that site. And the applicant has to show that as being true everywhere. Same thing with bioretention. If you show that permeable pavement is infeasible because of the high, well, the roads now, you have to look at the roads and look, can bioretention be used on the roads? If it's feasible, yes, it can. And so now you have to install bioretention along the roads. Okay. And you still must meet minimum 6 and minimum 7 if you have to meet all minimum requirements. Just because you're not putting in BMPs for minimum requirement number 5 doesn't get you out of all those other ones. And I found This is just an aside here. I found that when you're doing the list option for subdivisions, for commercial sites, if you're doing the list option and you're adding permeable pavement and bioretention to your list option, I would suggest, and it's feasible for those, I'd suggest you go back and look at the LID performance standard to see if that works, because that may require less BMPs or fewer BMPs to meet those than the list option required. So if you have to do permeable pavement and bioretention for your list option, you need to go back and look at the LID performance standard. If these things are feasible under the list, they're probably available to you under the performance standard. Now, if you have a project site that is discharging to meet flow control exempt waters, and you meet all those other requirements to show that your site is indeed flow control exempt, like having constructed conveyance all the way from your site to the flow control exempt water body, and that conveyance has capacity for full build out of that basin along that upstream and along that entire constructed flow path. So you are indeed flow control exempt. You use list number 3. List number 3 does not include the items for bioretention and permeable pavement and full dispersion and those kind of things. Remember, minimum requirement number 5 is a flow rate minimum requirement. And if you don't have to do it for minimum requirement number 7, you certainly shouldn't have to do it for minimum requirement number 5. But you have to do these things where required, where feasible. These items were identified in previous permits, and we can't remove them and backslide from those previous permits and allow us to not include these. So even if you're flow control exempt, there are still things in minimum requirement number 5 list that you may end up having to do. And just what do we mean by infeasibility? Infeasibility, those infeasibility criteria apply to minimum requirement number 5 only. So in minimum requirement number 5, you're going through a list. We are requiring, Ecology is requiring the applicant to build something if it's feasible. We're saying if a bioretention facility is feasible, you must build it. So we're giving you an out. We're saying if it's infeasible, you don't have to build it. But if it's feasible, you have to build it. But if we're not looking at minimum requirement number 5 anymore, and the applicant is designing something to meet minimum requirement number 6 or 7, they want to install bioretention there, they can install bioretention. They don't have to if it's identified as infeasible. Because the infiltration rate's too low, that infiltration rate's high enough so that they could get a benefit from installing bioretention, even though it's identified as infeasible under minimum requirement number 5. You can still install bioretention with a lower infiltration rate if you model it with that lower infiltration rate. And you may be able to meet the LID performance standard if you model it at a lower infiltration rate and not have to do with the list option. So where the feasibility, bioretention, permeable pavement, direct infiltration, all those things, the infeasibility criteria only apply when you're looking at minimum requirement number 5 list options. They don't apply elsewhere for minimum requirement number 6 and 7. So we're moving on to minimum requirement number 6, runoff treatment. Here's where you have an additional threshold. And that additional threshold of 5,000 square feet of effective PGS in a threshold discharge area. My next slide talks about TDAs. What we're doing with minimum requirement number 6 is we want to reduce pollutant loads. And we want to reduce pollutant loads specifically for TSS, dissolved copper, dissolved zinc, total phosphorus, and oil. And min required number 6, if you have to do min required number 6 and you pass this additional threshold, you have to do basic treatment as a minimum. So let's spend a couple minutes talking about TDAs. So if you have a site, a project site, and the entire site drains to a single point and it all discharges from that single point, that entire site is a single TDA. So you look at that entire site, and if it has greater than 5,000 square feet of effective pollution generating impervious surface, a pollution generating impervious surface, then you have to do a min required number 6 for that site. Looking over the right-hand side here, if you have a site that has a ridge line down the middle and half drains to one location and half drains to another location, and those two locations don't come back together for a quarter mile, the shortest distance is a quarter mile, then you have two separate TDAs, and you look at min required number 6 and number 7 independently for those two TDAs. So you could have had 6,000 square feet of new and replaced hard surface when you're looking at the threshold flow chart. And that tells you I have to look at min required number 6. Now that I'm looking at min required number 6, I look at it and I say, I've got 3,000 square feet in TDA 1 and 3,000 square feet in TDA 2. I don't exceed the 5,000 square feet per TDA. Therefore, I don't have to do min requirement number 6. That becomes a TDA analysis, and you have to be over 5,000 for each TDA. If you have water leaving your site in two places, and the shortest location, the shortest distance in either of those stream channels is less than a quarter mile, then you have one TDA. And you have to look at that as a single TDA. So you're back to that 6,000 square feet of pollution generating impervious surface. So you can reduce the amount of treatment you have to do if you have multiple TDAs. And so one of the things you have to look at early, once you pass your project level flowchart analysis, when you get to min required number 6, you have to look at the TDAs. And you can't create a new discharge point that goes to a different basin. Min required number 4 says you have to send it all in the same basin. So I can't take the runoff from TDA number 2 and send it to a different basin and say, now I have two TDAs. I have to send it to the same basin. And if within the same basin, it's less than a quarter mile, I still have a single TDA. Min required number 7 also looks at TDAs, but it's 10,000 square feet of effective impervious surfaces in a TDA, or a 0.15 CFS increase over the 100-year, the existing 100-year flow frequency. 10,000 square feet is about what it takes to get that 0.15 increase. We don't want to have to put flow control on small projects. So if you don't have the 10,000 square feet per TDA, if you have more than 5,000 square feet, but you have more than 10,000 per TDA, you don't have to do min required number 7. And again, your pre-developed conditions are forest or prairie. I don't want to see impervious or landscape in the pre-developed conditions. That's wrong. Okay, you don't do that. And we've created our min required number 5 and min required number 7 to butt together here at 50% of the 2-year flow. So flow control, the less frequent, larger storms are min required number 7. The more frequent, smaller storms are min required number 5. And so if you're doing the LID performance standard, and minimum requirement number 7, that red line has to be to the left of the blue line for the entire length of this pre-developed condition. Minimum requirement number 8, we have a lot of guidance in Appendix 1D. The big thing I want to get across is you cannot use an existing wetland for flow control or treatment. If you're discharging into an existing wetland, either on-site or off-site, but you're going directly into it, all your treatment and flow control BMPs must be completed prior to the area, to the wetland. And you're matching average daily and monthly volume in the wetlands. And so we're looking at comparison of wetlands to existing conditions, not foresting conditions. So here's another pre-developed run you have to do when you're analyzing wetlands. And minimum requirement number 9, if you include a BMP in minimum requirements 5, 6, or 7, you need to have an O&M manual for that BMP. And last but not least, we talk about conveyance. We don't address conveyance. We don't care about conveyance. Local jurisdictions have to identify what conveyance sizing is. And we suggest you use one of the conveyance methods, the rational method, Santa Barbara Unit Hydrograph, TR55, HEC HMS, a spreadsheet, whatever you want to use. We don't address conveyance in the SWMS. The area you have, yes, you cannot use the wetland buffer for treatment. There is an exception to that. If you're dispersing runoff across native landscaping and you need to have 50 feet, you can use the buffer as part of that length of your dispersion going into the wetland. But it's only for when you're already dispersing water. Prior to getting to the buffer, you can use that buffer width as part of your dispersion length. But if you've got water in a pipe and you're treating it and then putting it into the wetland, you have to have that all done and flow controlled before you go to the buffer. If you put the roof runoff into dry wells or infiltration trenches, UICs, then you take it out of the WWHM. It's no longer part. If you size those for the entire flow runoff file for the roof, then it's no longer going to be coming into the runoff that needs to be treated. If you size the dry wells or trench for smaller than the full runoff file, then water is going to discharge from the dry wells and commingle with runoff from the disturbed lands, and that will need to be treated. So when your WWHM model, you simulate runoff going into the dry well, you simulate the dry well activity, and if it discharges at any time during the storm, it'll have to get treated. So the best way to keep runoff from the roof from having to be treated is to be able to put it all into the ground immediately. And I do mean all. Okay, that's secondary threshold. So when you're running minimum when you're looking at the secondary threshold, you need to look at the increase over the existing conditions. That 0.15 is an increase over existing conditions. And if you exceed that number, when you do your analysis, if you have more than 10,000 square feet of effective impervious surface, and your increase over existing conditions is more than 0.15 CFS in the 100-year storm, that means you now have to do minimum required number 7. And in doing minimum required number 7, you have to compare the mitigated conditions to the pre-developed conditions and those pre-developed conditions, when you're doing minimum required number 7, are forested. Okay, so you have different steps along the process to determine if you have to do minimum required number 7. The first one is, are you greater than 5,000 square feet of new and replaced impervious surface? That tells you you have to do minimum required number 7. Now you're at minimum required number 7. Look at the secondary thresholds. Secondary threshold number 1, 10,000 square feet. If I'm over that, yes. Secondary threshold number 2, did I increase my existing conditions by more than 0.15 to the mitigating conditions? If my answer is yes, I now have to do minimum required number 7. And when I do minimum required number 7, I compare my mitigating conditions to forested pre-developed conditions.